So thank you again, everybody, for showing up. I know it's been a great difficulty even just walking across campus today. And I hope that you find this to be worth the trip across the tundra. I'd like to thank Dr. Rick Yana in particular for making this happen. I found out about this very late, and I'm very enthusiastic. Thank you to everybody who's here. Thank you to Publicity, AWC, the gods, the goddesses, everything for making this happen. So it's my honor to formally introduce Dr. Anna Castillo. So please just bear with me for a few minutes. Dr. Anna Castillo, award-winning writer, editor, and scholar, brings to Yuma tonight not only a vast catalog of publications, but also a vast consciousness, one engaged in creation, reinvention, and revisiting of themes in her works, and a seemingly boundless interest in expression of self. Among her works are So Far From God, Zapagonia, Lover Boys, Goddess of the Americas, and Massacre of the Dreamers, all of which are for sale in the corner. Although recently in the news for her books So Far From God and Lover Boys being placed on the list of books banned from Tucson high school classes, placing her in such company as Rodolfo Anaya, William Shakespeare, and Gloria Anzaldúa, Dr. Castillo has long been an influential figure in writing, infusing themes of Chicanismo, spirituality, self-awareness, and the journeys of our lives. Last year, for example, at a conference on women and mythology, her presence as keynote speaker was noted with the following review. Castillo was the quantum wave crashing at a conference dedicated to healing the rift between academic disciplines. She was providing the missing feminine voice capable of renewing the goddess movement on a global scale. Now, the mother goddess, Tonantzin, Guadalupe, Great Mother, was my first experience of Anna Castillo's work through Goddess of the Americas, her edited collection on the Guadalupe figure. Later, in Massacre of the Dreamers, the connection with her work and themes further resonated in me with lines such as the following under the subheading Moyocoyotzin, She Who Creates Herself. Here is the juncture where I believe Chicanismo is formed, in the acknowledgement of the historical crossroad, Aztec Empire and then the Spanish conquest, where the creative power of woman became deliberately appropriated by male society, and woman in the flesh was thereafter subjugated. Just after this, she writes, what I hope to be my goal in learning how to travel the path of self-definition. The crucial distinction between the labels we have been given by the state and our own self-naming is that only doing the latter serves us. The very act of self-definition is a rejection of colonization. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Anna Castillo.
I'm going to read a few selections this evening and share with you a little bit about what I've been up to in the last lifetime. This book is called So Far From God. I believe that some of you may have read it or familiarized yourselves with it from my visit. The title, So Far From God, is part of a quote that was attributed to the dictator of Mexico at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. It's just before the Mexican Revolution, who was said to have said, "Oh, poor Mexico, so far from God, so near the United States." Now, this book takes place in northern New Mexico, back in the days before cars and plane travel. It was very difficult to get from the capital, which, by the way, then was Mexico City, all the way up in northern New Mexico. Time went on, and people felt isolated, abandoned. New Mexico is now among, unfortunately, the poorest states in our nation. It sits right on the border with one of our most prosperous states in the nation. In living up there, I discovered that the people had paraphrased that supposed quote, and to, "Oh, poor New Mexico, so far from heaven, so near Texas." So this is the beginning of the story, So Far From God. The chapter title is almost as long as the section I'm going to share with you. an account of the first astonishing occurrence in the lives of a woman named Sophia and her 4 fated daughters, and the equally astonishing return of her wayward husband. La Loca was only 3 years old when she died. Her mother, Sophie, woke at 12 midnight to the howling and neighing of the 5 dogs, 6 cats, and 4 horses, whose custom it was to go freely in and out of the house. Sophie got up and tiptoed out of her room. The animals were kicking and crying and running back and forth with their ears back and fur standing on end, but Sophie couldn't make out what their agitation was about. She checked the bedroom with the 3 older girls. Esperanza, the eldest, had her arms wrapped around the 2 smaller ones, Fe and Caridad. They were sleeping strangely undisturbed by the excitement of the animals. Sophie went back into her own room, where her baby, the 3-year-old, had slept ever since Sophie's husband disappeared. She put the baseball bat that she had taken with her when checking the house back under the bed, just in case she encountered some tonto who had gotten ideas about the woman who lived with her 4 little girls by the ditch at the end of the road. It was then that she noticed the baby, although apparently asleep, jerking. The little body possessed by something unknown that caused her to thrash about violently until finally she fell off the bed. She ran around to pick her up, but she was so frightened by her little daughter's seizure, she stopped short. The baby continued to thrash about, banging her little arms and legs against the hard stone floor, white foam mixed with the little blood spilling from the corners of her mouth, and worst of all, her eyes were now opened, rolled all the way to the top of her head. Sophie screamed and called out, "Ave Maria Purissimas," and finally her 3 other precious children came running in. Mom, what happened?" And then everyone was screaming and moaning because the baby had stopped moving, lay perfectly still, and they knew she was dead. The day after the wake, the neighbors all came out to accompany Sophie and the girls to the church at Tomé, where Sophie wanted the little baby's mass to be held before they laid her into the cold ground. Everyone Sophie knew was there. The baby's godparents, all of Sophie's comadres and compadres, her sister from Phoenix, everyone except, of course, the baby's father, since no one had seen hide nor hair of him since he left Sophie and the girls. That marriage had a black ribbon on its door from the beginning. Sophie's grandfather had refused to give the young lovers his blessing. The father had forbidden Sophie's querido to step foot in their house during the 3-year courtship. And the local parish priest joined the opposition when he refused to marry the couple in church. Nobody believed that Domingo was good enough for little Sophie. Not her sister, not her mother, not even her favorite teacher in high school, La Miss Hill, who had nothing but praise for Sophie's common sense and intelligence. Nobody thought El Domingo would make a good husband because of the fact that he liked to gamble. Gambling was in the man's blood, and gambling is what Sophie did when she ran off with him, sheltered by the dark night of a new moon, and came back a señora. And then nobody could say nothing about it but wait for the inevitable failure of Sophie's marriage. It was 118 degrees the day of Sophie's baby daughter's funeral, and the 2 pallbearers, upon the instruction of Father Jerome, placed a small casket on the ground just in front of the church. No one was quite certain what Father Jerome had planned when he paused there in the hot sun. Maybe some last-minute prayers or instructions for the mourners before entering the house of God. He wiped his brow with his handkerchief. In fact, he was a little concerned about the grieving mother, who at that point was showing signs of losing it, trembling and nearly collapsing between 2 others. Father Jerome thought it perhaps a good idea to advise them all on funeral decorum. "As devoted followers of Christ," he began, "we must not show our lack of faith in Him at these times and in His, our Father's, fair judgment, who alone knows why we are here on this earth and why He chooses to call us back when He does. Why, why? That's exactly what Sophie wanted to know at that moment, when all she had ever done was accept God's will, as if it hadn't been punishment enough to be abandoned by her husband, then for no apparent reason and without warning, save the horrible commotion of the animals that night, her baby was taken away. Oh, why, why? That's all she wanted to know. At that moment, while Sophie threw herself on the ground, pounding it with her rough fist, her compadres crying alongside her, saying, "Please, please, comadre, get up. The Lord alone knows what He does. Listen to the Padre." Esperanza let out a shriek, long and so high-pitched, it started some dogs barking in the distance. Sophie had stopped crying to see what was causing the girl's hysteria, when suddenly the priest, who finally stood alone next to the baby's coffin, while the whole crowd began to scream and faint and move away. The lid had pushed all the way open, and the little girl inside sat up, just as sweetly as if she had woken from a nap, looking around and squinting her eyes against the harsh light. "Mommy?" Father Jerome got hold of himself and sprinkled holy water in the direction of the child, but for the moment was too stunned to utter so much as a word of prayer. Then, as if all this was not amazing enough, as Father Jerome moved toward the child, she lifted herself up into the air and landed on the church roof. "Don't touch me, don't touch me," she warned. This was only the beginning of the child's long life's phobia of people. She wasn't one of those afflicted with an exaggerated fear of germs and contagion. For the rest of her life, however, she was to be repulsed by the smell of humans. She claimed that all humans bore an odor akin to that which she had smelled in the places she had passed through when she was dead. Where she had gone, she revealed from the rooftop that day, within the limited ability of a 3-year-old's vocabulary in Spanish and English. Meanwhile, everyone below was either genuflecting or paralyzed and crossing themselves over and over as she spoke. Well, I'll leave it to you to look for the story. If you haven't read it and you don't know what happens to this little girl's life and her story, I'll stop there. I wrote for many years. When I started to write many years ago, I only wrote poetry. I'm a self-taught poet and writer. I studied other things, and I had it in my mind that if I was going to be a good poet, the only thing I could do was write poetry. Yes, I did go to work, I did have to live a life, but as far as my creativity went, I wrote only poetry. And I did this for many years. And then I began to come to the realization that everybody writes poetry. Less people read it, and nobody buys poetry. So my stories began to grow, and that's how I ended up writing stories, long stories from left to right margin, and novels and fiction and so on. But I'd like to go back to poetry, which was my first love, and share with you some of my poems this evening. These poems are in a book called I Ask the Impossible, and if you knew me, you might agree, I do. This is a poem that I wrote for my son when he was a child. We traveled quite a bit, and we were on a road trip, and so he might have been around 12 years old when I wrote this. Some time passed, we moved again, and this poem was selected by a project that was called Poetry in Motion, and it was put on very beautiful posters around the country. It was traveled in the New York subway, and it was in a billboard over the Santa Monica Boulevard. When we moved back to our hometown of Chicago, at that time, coincidentally, this poem was in a very beautiful poster riding around in the Chicago buses and subways and trains. Now, I had not told my son about this poem, and he was just about to start high school, so he'd take public transportation, take the train back and forth, and I thought one of these days he's going to see it, and it'll be a very nice surprise for him. The poem also was dedicated to him. His name was on there. One day he came home from school, and he said, "You know, Mom, I was on the train today, and I saw that poem that you wrote for me." And I said, "Yes?" And he said, "You know, it's very embarrassing." Now here's to embarrass him a little more. It's called El Chicle. Mijo and I were laughing, ha ha ha, when the gum he chewed fell out of his mouth and into my hair, which after I clipped it flew in the air on the back of a dragonfly that dipped in the creek and was snapped fast by a turtle that reached high and swam deep. Mijo wondered what happened to that gum, worried that it stuck to the back of my seat, and Mommy will be mad when she can't get it out. Meanwhile, the turtle in the pond that ate the dragonfly that carried the hair with the gum swam south on Saturday and hasn't been seen once since. Right next to it is a poem from a memory of my own around the age of when my son was, when I wrote this poem. And this poem is called No Dogs or Mexicans Allowed. We were on our way to Laredo from Chicago when the bus stopped at a diner in Texas somewhere. Mommy and I got off quietly, the way we did things then, unobtrusive, the way we always have done things or left them undone. Inside, as the rest ate, we waited and waited while no one took our order. The driver called out, "Everyone on board," and it was time to go. Mommy took my hand and hurried me along so as not to be left behind. We did not eat that afternoon. That was a long time ago, but my memory is probably better than a dog's. So time goes on, and one of the things I'm always asked, writers and artists are always asked, I think, what inspires us, where we get our material from. And when I was a very young poet, and my work at a young age was going out into the world and was published and was taught in colleges and so forth, people made assumptions that all the poems were autobiographical, and so they would always say, you know, "Oh, this poor girl, look at this poor Chicana, the things that she has gone through." And sometimes our poetry is autobiographical, and sometimes the poet serves as witness. And this is the course that I began to take when I decided to move from the visual arts to writing poetry and then writing stories. In the mid to late 90s, I read the story about a nun who was originally from New Mexico, and I was reading an interview about her experiences as a missionary in Central America. It moved me very much. She was trying at this time, and never has been able to get the United States to admit to its participation in what happened to her as a missionary in Guatemala. I wrote this poem at that time, and it came out in this book. Since then, I wrote 2 versions of a play which was produced and has been performed around the country, and was produced in Chicago twice, and has been performed and read in campuses and so forth. It's not a story only about this nun, and it's not a question of what was going on in the late 90s. I didn't write it about Guatemala. I wrote it about ourselves as human beings in the world. The Amnesty International says there are 66 countries that are known to violate human rights and to practice torture. The United States is one of them. So In no way was I citing one particular place, but rather a particular case tells us a great deal about the world that we live in. I took for the title a quote from her. Her name is Sister Diana Ortiz, and I have since been greatly blessed to have her, to get to know her, and have her as now a personal friend who's still working and now works to help people who are getting away from these situations throughout the world. The poem is called, "Like the People of Guatemala, I Want to Be Free of These Memories." Every morning, we rise out of our beds in Minnesota, Chicago, Los Angeles perhaps, wrapped in the security of our flag, secure in the dream that we are and always will be safe. We have simply to rise and work hard, if only the world took our example. Once a year, we take out our passports and plan vacations to visit friends and relations south. We do not think that by chance, a case of mistaken identity, let's say, a wish for peace expressed too loudly, disdain for a government uttered without discretion, we might end like Sister Diana Ortiz, whose crime was to be an American citizen, a school teacher. Who can say? In a country the size of a pearl, in a poor beyond poor country, populated by a dispensable race undergoing civil war. But she did not commit a crime. No government ever accused her of any. The official report is that nothing happened. Instead, it is claimed she is insane. A woman given to hysterics. A crazed lesbian who put 111 cigarette marks on her own back. Or a sadistic lover in the convent burned her out of passion. It makes more sense than a nun being abducted from her courtyard without explanation one afternoon when the sun fell on the red shingled roof just so, and the children had gone home, but some had stayed for the bread the madrecitas baked, and others always stay because they have nowhere to go. More sense than being raped by a pack of dogs in uniform like a stray bitch in heat, burned 111 times with cigarette butts, thrown in a pit. Yes, a pit. Like a lamb is thrown in a pit for a Sunday picnic, but the lamb, once slaughtered, is merciful. A merciful cut to the throat is placed with greater care than was Sister Diana Ortiz, half naked and burned, and yes, by then, crazed. She fell on other bodies, some alive, some beheaded, rats eating the rest. This is what is known as the nightmare from which a person does not, will not, could not awake. And what followed next has no name. Rise at peace with yourself, if you will, tomorrow. Be content with your president, your local officials, the small and big things that they do. Complain during elections about what they do not. But don't think of Sister Diana Ortiz or the soldier who put a small machete in her hand. Yes, it is time to die, thought the nun. Let me die. And she prayed in Our Father, or rather addressed the same supreme maker that you or I or any American citizen might address at the hour of our death. The soldier's hands around hers that held the small machete that was not used on her own body, swung it forward instead, and she slashed another woman also in the pit, saw the woman's blood spurt out like the blood of a pig, felt the woman's blood still warm with heartbeat spray her face, tasted it on her teeth as she heard the woman's screams mixed with her own. Who was shouting loudest? Sister Diana Ortiz did not know. She did not know. Now, years later, she sits in vigil on government steps, your government and mine, in Washington, D.C., and wants to know precisely who screamed loudest. She wants to know why human beings in Guatemala are slaughtered like pigs on Saturday, why civilians are made sacrificial lambs, and why a gringo saved her at last like a knight, but who was not a knight. He was the chief of those, she says, burned her, violated her from body to soul, although they did not take her soul. Those soulless themselves who have mutilated women, hungry children, unarmed civilians, la raza indígena, the illiterate, unskilled, bewildered and besieged for 4 decades, or have given the orders to do so, or provided the means, did not take her soul. Like the people of Guatemala, I want to be free of these memories. I do not want to lose my soul, traded so cheaply here. When we rise out of our snug beds and do not question who the gringo was who drove Sister Diana Ortiz to safety, who told her he too cared for the people of Guatemala and wanted to save them from communism at any cost. And those who seized her, burned her 111 times, threw her in a pit with rats and cadavers, made her kill, then pulled her back out and laughed as they took turns with her again and again, called the gringo chief, and asked him to join in on the fun. He was an American. Let us shout louder than her memory, louder than the unheard cries of 200,000 disappeared, buried alive in pits, thrown alive from planes, butchered and bayoneted, defenseless and blindfolded in the name of democracy. It is real, the nightmare, and without end. How can we sleep? How can we sleep? You can go online if you want to know what's going on with Sister Diana Ortiz. She has an organization, TASSC, Task, and she does work with torture survivors and brings them to safety and sanity. I don't want to leave you on that sad note. I would prefer to leave you with something very different. It's the title poem of this book, I Ask the Impossible. So as you can see, when I was a very young poet, and I would go, well, you can't see that, but you see now, and I'd go to some place and people would say, well, what do you do? And I'd say, well, I write poetry, or I would say, I'm a poet, and they'd say, ah, qué romántica. And you could see that that wasn't exactly my theme for a very, very, very long time. And it was, I think, even after So Far From God, after I was writing novels, on one very starlit night in New Mexico, I gave myself the assignment to try to write a love poem. And I found that it is very difficult to write a good love poem. It's not cheesy, not smarmy. After you say her lips were like roses, her eyes were like pools, and so on. And so this is what I came up with. If you are in love, let me know if it works for you. My official love poem, it's called I Ask the Impossible. I ask the impossible, love me forever. Love me when all desire is gone. Love me with the single-mindedness of a monk. When the world in its entirety and all that you hold sacred advise you against it, love me still more. When rage fills you and has no name, love me. When each step from your door to your job tires you, love me, and from job to home again. Love me when you're bored. When every woman you see is more beautiful than the last, or more pathetic. Love me as you always had, not as admirer or judge, but with the compassion you save for yourself in your solitude. Love me as you relish your loneliness, the anticipation of your death, mysteries of the flesh as it tears and mends. Love me as your most treasured childhood memory, and if there is none to recall, imagine one. Place me there with you. Love me withered as you loved me new. Love me as if I were forever, and I will make the impossible a simple act by loving you as I do. So I've been asked to stay and answer a few questions, and if I can, I will try. I said earlier, I can't tell you if you're going to win the lottery or anything like that, but if it's something that I might be able to answer, I would certainly try.
You're going to recognize him. You want this?
Test.
Very beautiful last poem.
Thank you.
I was here earlier today, and I heard you advising potential writers to rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. Did that poem take a lot of revision?
No.
Okay.
It did take some. I worked very hard on it. I'm not going to say, and this is one of the things that I did talk about today, and I think it's very, it's indicative of a young poet, not young in age, but young in writing, when they feel that they were inspired and they write and you can't touch it and no one should say anything about it, and if they don't get it, then something's wrong with them. You want to go off and kill yourself or something. You know, you're so attached to it. So it really was homework for me. And so I did work on it. Just like the poem before that, the Sister Diana poem, took about 2 weeks. So I worked on it very much the way I might work on my prose, which is I am writing and rewriting as I'm working on it. So I didn't go back to it maybe 2 weeks later or a month later, but at that time it did take, you know, some days to finesse it.
Hello. Is
Hello.
there any particular literary work that you find it very appealing and you keep going back to it, of any author that you have read, and why is that?
Other books, people's
yeah.
work? Yes. Over the years, I had always gone back to Neruda. Was somebody that I discovered when I did, like, this summer I decided to be a poet. A friend sent me Neruda, and then you say, like, oh no, never mind, I could never write like Neruda, so never mind. But I decided to learn from him, and I also used to declamar after I did start doing readings, and he was part of the repertoire, so I'm close to him, and Garcia, Lorca, and so on. There are some books and there are some writers that I enjoy, and I didn't go back to them very often. There was a book that was very made a great impression on me that I know that no one in this room knows, but I'll tell you the title. It's called The Three Marias. It was written by three women by the name of Maria, and they're Portuguese, new letters to the Portuguese. And if you ever look at it, you may understand why it affected me. And it's a book that I still keep in my library. It touched on many things that I felt were speaking to me at that time as a young woman of a Latina background and Catholic background, and a time when women really were not supposed to say what they thought. And these women in Portugal, when their book came out, they were immediately arrested because there was a very intense censorship in their country at that time. And so that was for me. That's what I always believe in writing, not what I can write, but what I'm prohibited to tell.
Hello.
Hello.
Let's go over a little bit. Reading your book, So Far from God, there was a lot of Spanish, and I was wondering how you decided when to write Spanish and when to just say what they were saying without actually saying the Spanish word.
In our communities on this side of the border, and especially old communities, and this one was definitely one of many hundreds of years, we evolve our way of speaking. And so what I found very endearing was the way that the northern New Mexicans spoke. And you also do it in border towns and other places. I do it every day. I'm from Chicago. It's just the way we speak. We just get used to it. So there are certain words that we like to use in Spanish, that we like the sound of them, and that we feel like you can only say it in Spanish. And it's embedded in our memories, our consciousness. And so really when I was writing it, there's an anonymous narrator. I heard her speaking that way. And so it came as a very natural flow, sort of getting into the character, if you will. And so I really didn't think that much about the Spanish or what was said in English. Had to be very careful with the Spanish and So Far from God. Although I'm fluent in Spanish, it's not northern New Mexican Spanish. So I had a Southwestern Spanish dictionary at my desk to make sure that the Spanish word that I would have used is maybe the same way, and sometimes they pronounce it differently. Little things like that. So that's the kind of stuff that I was talking about earlier today about when you have to rewrite. But the thing that the publisher, this was W.W. Norton, that they had to defend and we had to discuss was not the Spanish, strangely enough, and not the fact that we're not italicizing the Spanish because this is native to this territory, but the fact that I insisted on using double negatives and in some cases triple negatives. The copy editors went crazy with that, with the I don't know nothing and you don't know nothing, but that's the way, people talk, and so we had to defend that. But so it was really just sort of like oral storytelling, but writing it down.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
In the local paper, the headline read that a Chicana author was coming to Yuma. Do you mind being known as a Chicana author? Do you want to just be known as an author?
It would be very nice if we lived in a world in which in 2013 we could say things like that. We don't. We still do see the center of the universe is a white privileged male. And I have to say it, nothing against the white privileged males in the room, that's just in literature, this is the assumption when we talk empirically. And so anything moving away from that gets described. So it could be paraplegic writer. It could be, whatever else, whatever else they feel that people have to adjust their perspective and do that. And so when it started out, when we started to get around, my peers and I, we thought it was pretty funny. We'd go someplace and would say, poor Chicana writers, because it did sound kind of funny to us that it would have to be labeled that way. I've had other labels, some not so nice. The way I look at it, they also go in front of writing. So it's part of the introduction. If they name you, if you name yourself, it's different than when they name you. But it is a name that it is a way of people understanding the perspective, and so I really don't have a big argument with it at the end of the day. Yes. Oh, he's going that way. Sorry.
Sorry to ask. What does it feel like to be famous? I mean, known.
I don't know. I don't know. I have to ask somebody who's famous. I don't have any sense of that, but I will tell you that a few years ago, I introduced 5 new authors. I was asked to introduce 5 new novelists at a major conference, and it was going to be a book conference. It was going to be in Chicago, and so I was asked if I would be so kind as to say some words about them. One of those authors had taught my books in his classes and so on, and we had a nice talk. And a year later, I met him again, and he said that people asked him, "What's it like meeting Anna Castillo? What's Anna Castillo like?" And he said, "That's the thing about Anna Castillo. She doesn't know she's Anna Castillo." And I thought, and I didn't know it in that moment when he was saying that, and I've thought about that for a long time, and I think that pretty much explains my separation from my work, what I do, and who I am to my family and people in my life. To take my work seriously, I don't take myself that seriously.
Do you get criticism about your work, and how do you accept it?
Literary criticism, I learned a very long time ago. It's a whole different ball of wax. Don't pay attention. I don't pay attention to it. I don't read it. I don't understand it. I have nothing to do with it. There it is. It's a field separate from what I do. The criticism that is a little more difficult to take is when you get a bad review in a newspaper, or somebody does something horrible in a venue that could hurt your readership. And I try to avoid those, so consequently I only read what's told to me was a good review. I don't want to ruin my day.
Okay. I have to be careful how I ask this, because it's personal for me, but are you ever 100% satisfied with your writing?
Never.
I'm not alone.
When did you write your first book, and what made you to write it?
First book was what we called chapbooks, and they're still called chapbooks, but things are changing now. Chapbook was a very small pamphlet size, limited edition, meant to introduce the work to maybe a publisher. I did that when I was in my mid-20s. My very first poems, my mother pointed out to me, I wrote when I was about 9 years old. They were like my official poems in the playground, showing them to the other children. I forgot about that because I thought I was going to be a visual artist, a painter. And so I never really paid too much attention to the stories and the poems that I was writing. But around that time when I did the chapbook, I had been published in anthologies, but I thought if I was going to be serious, I should have something to show, and so I did that first small book. Do you remember in those days, U.S. Latinas were not published in this country. We weren't published in any country. but we were not published in the country we were born in.
Anna,
Yes.
has anyone in your family followed your footsteps in becoming a poet and a writer?
No, and they don't really, nobody recognizes it because they don't really read. But my son likes to do a lot of things, and he does like to write. When he was in college, I actually taught at the same college that he was in, and I remember going to give a reading somewhere in Chicago, and some of my audience said they had just heard my son read poetry in some venue, and I was the first time I heard he was reading poetry. And I asked, how is he? Is he pretty good, or is he okay? Yeah, he's pretty good. So he likes to write, so he's working on something right now, but that's not his forte. He's in law.
Last call. Thank you very, right underneath the buzzer.
The moment.
Just a quick question. I'll have to admit I have a little bit of a bias. I prefer women writers. I like character analysis, and I find, in general, in my perspective, women tend to do better at that. What is your opinion on, are there differences? Is my bias accurate?
This is like the $64,000 question. Is there such a thing as women's literature? Virginia Woolf, since Virginia Woolf, we have been arguing that. Obviously, before that, we weren't seeing very much in print by women. So I still have this this idea, similar to the Chicana thing. Does the ethnicity take away from the quote-unquote universality? We always say, well, the literature, the canon, the classics, that's universal, but is that universal if that's not our experience? So I have asked people, what about my literature distinguishes it from men? What's different about it? So I think it's just an unending question, and I would say that there has to be something about it. A good 80% on the average of my readership, the people who come to my memoir writing workshops are women. 20% brave men will show up that seem to move that aside. So I think that there is something that they're obviously seeing in literature. Literature, to me, writing is not a natural act. Speaking is a natural act. Developing language so that we can survive, and how we develop tools, those were natural acts to the human being. Where we get in our brains this coding that we do that we now call writing is something else. And so I think it is a very complicated question as to what makes it, can there be a literature? And it's also addressing how we see each other and how we perceive ourselves in society. So it's until we have a sense of seeing ourselves as people, we're going to make those distinctions.